They're coming along this afternoon. We've still got people coming in, but there's kind of a lot of content to cover, so I'm just gonna dive right in and kick things off right now. So this talk's gonna just focus on two different mobile Android surveillanceware tools that have been used against military and government. So these two families, Viper At and Frozen Cell.
Can you speak up? I think your microphone is on.
Check, check. Is that better? I'm too tall for this. All right, how's that? Cool. Thanks. All right, so the two families that I'll touch on are Viper At and Frozen Cell. I'll be talking about the different capabilities and functionality that they use to actually exfiltrate contents. Take a look at some infrastructure as well as some OPSEC fails. So these guys made a few mistakes that allowed for some insights into exactly who they're targeting. So we'll do like a high-level analysis on some of the exfil, and then we'll see just how effective they are. First of all, though, who am I? So my name is Michael Flossman, or just Flossman. I head up the threat intel services at Lookout Mobile Security. So I spend a lot of my time hunting for surveillanceware, looking for novel techniques that actors might be using, and basically tracking these actors in the different campaigns that they're running. So before that, spent some time or co-founded Tesserae Security, and prior to that, began my career in the Australian government on the defensive side of the house. So different security teams doing prototyping of security tools, vulnerability research, incident response, mobile security, as well as device hardening. And I remember back in 2011, when I was there, the Australian Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, decided that, or she took a fancy to the latest iPad. And she liked it so much that she wanted to actually use it to view classified material, which, as you can imagine, was a great job for those people tasked with trying to harden these tools and this gear. So what was probably interesting and unsurprising to a lot of people here was that not only was the PM moving to mobile, but so were a number of orgs. This was around the time BYOD was kicking off. A lot of people were interested in seeing how they could leverage that in their organizations. But on the flip side, we saw that the malicious actors out there were doing the exact same thing. So you guys are probably familiar with these two banking Trojan tools for desktop. On the left, we've got SpyEye, Alexander Panin and BX1. On the right, we've got the Jabazeus crew. And pretty much the goals of these tools, once they compromised the desktop environment, was to gather as much information as possible that would allow the actors behind them to actually make fraudulent transactions. And it's estimated that cumulatively they pulled back close to $1 billion. So these guys were raking a lot of cash and really successful. And I guess the reasons, or one of the results of their success was banks actually implementing security controls around this to try and mitigate their success. So we saw the implementation of mobile transaction authentication numbers, MTANs. Pretty much when you go to make a transaction online on your desktop, you receive an SMS to your mobile device that's tied to that transaction. Pretty straightforward sort of stuff. And that kind of mitigated this threat for a short amount of time. But what we eventually saw was that these actors rapidly evolved, they adapted, and they, for SpyEye, they released SpyEye in the mobile, so Spitmo. So a mobile counterpart to their tool that was, whose goal was to intercept these codes. And we saw the same thing from Zeus. And I guess, like, the biggest thing is that not only are financial actors making that transition, we're also seeing actors that are interested in gathering intelligence also making the same sort of shift to mobile. So I'm sure we're all aware of the different mobile surveillanceware tools on the sophisticated end of the spectrum that are being released by orgs like Gamma Group in terms of Finfisher, Hacking Team, and as well as NSO Group. But I think as researchers, we sometimes underestimate the effectiveness of actors that are operating at the lower end of the cost spectrum when it comes to exploits. So the two families that I'll talk about today, they don't use exploits, but it's worth keeping in mind that when you take out these exploits, the surveillanceware capabilities and the underlying functionality to gather all that intel is pretty much the same, regardless of where you fall on the exploit spectrum. And in a lot of cases, they're actually identical. So if we're not using 0 days, what are our attack vectors? Now, more often than not, a text message that's carefully crafted, along with some social engineering, is surprisingly all that's needed. So messages like this that appear to be sent from females, super effective. And what's worth keeping in mind is that this attack vector approach is nowhere near the cost of developing your own 0 days. And also means if your tooling falls into the hands of security researchers, your entire exploit chain isn't getting burnt. So that's exactly what we saw in the case of ViperRat. So this was a targeted attack that occurred earlier this year in January and February. At least that's when we reported on it. It's likely been running for much longer than that. And that's the approach they took. So members of the Israeli military were engaged with or received messages on social media platforms from seemingly attractive women who basically engaged in a conversation that followed along the lines of, I'll send you more photos of myself, but I don't like this chat platform that we're currently using. Can you install this custom one that I just sent you? So that's what we're seeing with these first stages. If these guys had actually followed through and clicked on these links, this is the applications that they'd be interacting with. So we can see 3 fake messaging applications: WowWow Messenger, SR Chat, and YeCall Pro. This adversary is kind of lazy when it comes to developing chat apps. So the full functionality of the chat client is not implemented at all. And there's a lot of social engineering, I think, that goes around tricking or misdirecting the target into thinking that, hey, something went wrong during this process, we're just going to uninstall our application. Sorry to bother you. One of the things that really irritated me, maybe this is just me, but there are a lot of spelling errors. Like they misspelled cancel, and I don't know. I guess they don't have a QA team or something, but that should be a red flag right there. So there were other first stages, so Trojanized apps that also had legitimate functionality in them. So things like call stat applications, games, as well as media players. In terms of capability, first stage is very much focused on having a minimal footprint on the device, so not much code, and its goal is to profile a user before determining and managing the installation of a second stage, which contains the core capabilities. So in terms of permissions, there's really not too much here that would flag this app as being suspicious. I mean, the worst thing there is install and delete packages, but certainly no access of sensitive information. So second stages, as I mentioned, the first stage profiles a user's device. It tells the C2 what apps are running on a user's device, and that is used to actually determine what second stage should be downloaded. And the purpose of that is to basically hide or download a second stage that won't stand out in a victim's environment. So if you're running WhatsApp and you're infected with ViperRat, you'll probably download a WhatsApp update. And same thing for Viber. If neither of those apps exist, then you'll just receive a standard system update. So yeah, that looks very legit. 2 WhatsApp and 1's an update. Sure. So as I mentioned before, second stage is where the bulk of the intelligence gathering capability exists. Some of the cool things that it can do: gather Office docs, PDFs, retrieve WhatsApp, the WhatsApp database, as well as the key for decryption. It does, in order to do that, it does rely on the SU binary being present. Some of the other capability, gathering user dictionary words, so words that you've entered into other applications, as well as extracting the associated app ID and the frequency with which those words have been entered. So that'd be like useful in determining like passwords that have been entered into other apps. And if you're looking at these samples yourself, you'll most definitely come across a couple of DLLs that you might be wondering what the hell they're doing there. They're not actually DLLs, as you'd expect. So If you pull it apart, there are both, one's an initialization vector and one's a security key, and they're both used as key material for downloading further updates. Other capability, fairly standard sort of stuff, recording audio, video, taking screenshots, kind of like the stock surveillance capability. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the gap between groups like Finfisher, NSO Group, and this particular tool. It's mainly the exploit chain. So if you remove that, these capabilities are present in all those families. So looking at some of the infrastructure, we can see. Nope. Do you want to see the infrastructure slide? Right then.
Give it just a sec.
Okay. Right. We're back. Cool. So one of the things that's worth noting with the infrastructure is that each sample contains hard-coded C2 information. So there's no resilience to takedowns. There's no domain generation algorithms in any of these samples. They do control or they do use a number of different C2s. It's unclear whether these are different campaigns, but that's something we're continuing to look at. So these guys, like further poking of C2 infrastructure shows that they do have directory indexing on, which is awesome for us as researchers. I will take a peek at anything you're exposing inadvertently on your C2. So looking at this stuff and running file magic over it, or file, it doesn't come up with any content type. If we cut it out, we can see it's a combination of base 64 followed by some binary data. And if we run ent over it, there's a good indication. Well, it's got a high entropy, so there's part of it that's probably encrypted, if not all of it. So to understand what's going on there, let's take a look at the client and actually have a look at how content is exfiltrated and handled. So files to be stolen or exfiltrated off these devices are first password protected using a hard-coded password. So that's gzips. A randomly generated key is then used is used as part of the AES process to encrypt this. That AES key is then encrypted with an RSA, encrypted using RSA. And then the result of that, if we go back to what we just saw, is we get the prepended encrypted AES key is base 64 encoded at the top. And following that is the encrypted victim data. So I don't know, is that game over? Is there anything else that we can do here? I don't know. I think we can still dig further. So taking a look at some of the directory structure on the server, we can see that there's a definite structure, and analyzing the client again, we can see that this structure is based on 3 pieces of information pulled from the client. So the ID, like an IME, the serial number, or a device ID is used in conjunction with the model to actually create this identifier. So we can actually reverse this pretty easily, and I'll just walk through an example super quickly. So this is the name of a directory on C2 infrastructure. We can look at the first digit, and the ID type is 1, so we know we're dealing with an IME here. Second digit is 7, so we know the model name of our compromised device in this case is 7 characters long. So then looking at the next 14 characters, these are indexes for the actual model name. So the first 2 digits is 23. So we can jump through this string to the content at 23, which is this 28. And this isn't in the slides, but for whatever reason, the actors behind this have pretty much, to reverse it, you need to add hex 37. So getting the character representation of 28 plus hex 37 gives us S. And then we can repeat this process through 27, 21, 19. And eventually, if we follow that out, we get Samsung. The remainder of the content is the IMEI of this particular device. So we can automate this process for across the entire C2 and figure out the IMEIs as well as the models of all compromised devices. So Samsung came out in top in terms of compromised devices there. And we can apply the same sort of approach in terms of analyzing the client in conjunction with looking at C2 server information to actually figure out how much content has been taken and what type of data it was, despite being encrypted. So when the client handles certain information and exfiltrates it, it uses a particular identifier or tag, and that tag is the folder name that we see on C2 infrastructure. So for example, the tag CCAPT 67 blah 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 correlates to images captured using the device camera, and there are a whole bunch of these. So what that means is, even though these guys haven't implemented any 0 days, we can see they're still being highly effective at gathering intel from close to 600 devices. And this is a snapshot taken of only a single command and control server. It's no doubt well over 600 by now, and no doubt well over 2.8 gig. So in total, that's 500,000 files. There's probably a lot of text on that slide, but graphs work as well. So we can see the majority of that content is images taken with the device camera. The rest of the content is less than 1%. So there are a few other things we can do looking at the C2 infrastructure. So we can actually use the modified timestamps to perform some sort of analysis into victim behavior, so exactly when they were active. We can do this because ViperAt takes pictures using the device camera when a user actually answers their phone. So we know that at these times users received calls. So what happened here is that we mirrored the C2, we ran log to timeline over all this data that we had, we then loaded it into Kibana, and running numerous filters around modified timestamps as well as those different tags that I just showed previously, we can use this to profile users. So they definitely peaked around here. I mean, this is 60,000 files in a single day. I'm not entirely sure what was going on there. And despite them tapering off, or it looking like they're tapering off, they're still collecting close to 1,000 files a day or a week. So in addition to profiling users, we can also have a look at when operators are actually active, when are they issuing instructions, and use that to get an insight into how they operate as well. So certain content type is only ever retrieved as a result of an actor or an operator issuing a specific command. So here we've got contacts, geolocation, SMS content. They're all pretty much ever retrieved on a Friday and a Saturday. Which is kind of interesting, given that is the weekend in certain Middle Eastern countries. So it's unclear if the actors are operating only on the weekends, or if they're doing this so that their behavior goes undetected. So the second family that I'll talk about is Frozen Cell. So this is a multi-platform actor that has been deploying tools for both desktop and Android. And they've been using some really interesting desktop lures. So these have included dismissal and promotion notices for Palestinian security services, as well as troop movement documents that have used the letterhead for General Directorate of Civil Defense, so Ministry of the Interior. And then we've also seen meeting minutes for documentation related to the primary political party in Palestine. So it seems very much based on that, focused on Palestine. There are a few outliers in that don't quite fit in. So Trump impersonated with models. Not entirely sure how that plays into this whole attack yet, or if that's something that Palestinians would click on. So like Frozen Rat, it doesn't rely on any exploits at all. we're looking primarily at Trojanized or fake updates that include Trojanized capability or surveillance capability. So we've seen things like WhatsApp Messenger, Facebook, Line, as well as this application on the top right, which is used by Jordanian and Palestinian students in their final year of study. So they're clearly, based on the desktop lures, likely targeting government, but there's also a distinct trend that we're seeing with the inclusion of content targeting students. Capabilities, very similar to what we've seen previously, so call recording, SMS retrieval, location tracking. Kind of interesting if it finds itself on a Huawei device with protected mode. So that's essentially a mode that doesn't allow apps to run when the screen is off, unless they're on this list explicitly. So it'll actually try and add itself silently to that list. In the event it can't, it will show a dialog to see if it can get added by the user. Also has out-of-bands communication. If C2 infrastructure goes down, Frozen Cell is still able to receive commands directly via SMS. So an SMS like this, Google verification code, would actually instruct Frozen Cell to record for an hour. So each dot represents an hour of total record time. And then similarly, a hash followed by 2 commas says, hey, stop recording. And there are a number of other capabilities that can be triggered via SMS. So if SMSs end in certain numbers, that can enable and disable certain receivers or enable and disable certain functionality. So what was interesting with this family is that some of their early variants didn't actually use GPS to geolocate devices. They used cell tower information, and they used the Open Cell ID service to do that. So how that works is that you basically gather cell tower info, provide it back to this service. It uses its database to geolocate devices for you. In order to use it, what's cool is that you obviously need to include an API key, but it gets even better. If you have that API key, you can see what previous devices, where previous geolocations have occurred. So we can take that, at least you used to be able to do this, you can't anymore. But we can take this API key and see that the majority of infected devices in earlier variants definitely line up with what we've seen around this threat actor targeting previously. So all devices are in smack bang in Gaza, Palestine, and that lines up. So in terms of infrastructure, we've got a mix of Windows and Linux. All have been found to be running Laravel 5 PHP framework. Documentation is definitely your friend. So looking at this particular family, and I guess the Laravel 5 PHP framework, and reading about how logging is handled, we can make educated guesses around what the actual paths are for server logging. And in this case, we're able to actually pull back a lot of these logs. Unfortunately for these guys, they contained usernames and passwords for a lot of their services. So kind of a big mistake from these guys. It almost feels like they went to the same OPSEC school as the Viper actors. So directory indexing on as well, which we've seen in the past. They were encrypting exfiltrated content, but it was slightly different. So they weren't using AES and RSA. They were using a combination of MD5 hash of an Android ID, the device manufacturer, as well as the device model. So once again, or I guess in this case, we're able to actually automate the decryption of all this content. So what we saw in this is a majority of content is recorded outbound calls, followed by images, as well as a fair amount of incoming calls. This has only been running for a month or so. This C2 gets regularly cleaned out, but in total we're dealing with around about 600 meg from 24 devices, and this is just a single C2. So the total amount of C2s that Frozen Cell use is significantly more than Viper out, and we see them frequently add C2s. So I don't think they're going anywhere, disappearing anytime soon. Cool. So just to summarize, these two threat actors are clearly on a budget. there's no investment in terms of exploit capability. So they have low operational costs. That risk of getting burned, of having, having 0 days as part of their attack chain, that's no longer there. But despite that, they're still highly effective. And even though they've had considerable OPSEC fails, and we reported on them earlier this year, they really don't care, and they're just continuing to gather intel from mobile devices. So, also just touching on Frozen Cell, the last family I spoke about, that kind of trend with actors becoming multi-platform is something that we're seeing way more often right now. So there are a number of other families that have multiple, that have tools for both desktop and mobile. I'll be releasing ISEs for both these families, and if you want to follow me on Twitter, @TerminalRift. I think we're out of time, but if there are any questions.
Did either one of you incorporate any features to make them more difficult than normal to remove?
Not beyond just like hiding their launch icon. So in terms of removing them, it's straightforward. Same with reverse engineering. There's no obfuscation, no packing at all. So.
Did you see any iOS samples?
Not yet. No iOS. Still hunting for those.
Cool. You say your Twitter handle one more time?
Terminal Rift.